Why does being in the middle class feel so poor? Times are tough right now and people are feeling it more than ever. It seems that everyday things like going to the grocery store cost 3 times more than usual, but at the same time, many Americans feel like wages have not increased at all recently. And many are asking themselves why. Now, I think the obvious answer is inflation, but let's dive into why we're still experiencing inflation and what are the other factors that are hurting the middle class right now. So enjoy this video where we discuss why the middle class is hurting and what they can expect in the future. But before we dive in, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos just like this. So answering these questions requires us to go all the way back to 2008 and look at the Great Recession, which was caused by the subprime lending crisis and in turn the housing bubble. In an attempt to battle this recession and get the country back on track, the Federal Reserve ended up dropping interest rates to all-time lows. And this was to help us stimulate the economy and get us out of the hole that Wall Street put us in. And it actually worked. From March 1st, 2009 to March 1st, 2019, the S&P 500 climbed all the way from $919.14 to a whopping $2,752.06, making that time period after the Great Recession one of the greatest bull runs in American history. And sure, the Great Recession was super harmful to many, but most people quickly forgot about it and the nation quickly moved on. And like I just showed you in that example, we enjoyed those low interest rates for quite a while. We saw some light rate increases prior to the 2020 pandemic, but interest rates still remained historically low. And this was further compounded by the pandemic. With a major worry about the economy while a majority of people were locked inside, the Fed dropped interest rates pretty much to 0%, again to further stimulate economic growth in a time where people just weren't leaving the house and weren't spending that much money. And things boomed, especially things like consumer goods, recreational products, fitness products, and anything that made life easier while trapped inside at home, like Zoom video meetings or Peloton bikes, which brought live spin classes directly to your home. And don't forget that most Americans also received stimulus payments, and a lot of people had increased unemployment benefits during that time as well, which further compounded that pent-up demand. And I'm sure you remember the pandemic also had some major impacts on our supply chain, delaying the shipments of key products and key materials, which created a limited supply for a lot of items during that time. This sharp increase in demand, coupled with the severe supply limitations we faced, resulted in consumers seeing steep inflation as many of those consumer sectors soared. So now that the pandemic's over, to battle that inflation, the Fed is stepping back in to raise interest rates, which put an end to those extremely low rates that we've been getting used to for over a decade. And this doesn't only affect mortgages, which is what most people are talking about right now. This increase in interest has also deeply affected corporations, because it is now much more expensive and much more difficult for these companies to borrow money to continue to grow their businesses. And this has led a lot of companies to slow down on hiring, be careful with giving out raises and promotions, and unfortunately in some cases, conduct mass layoffs. And the rough part is that this is intentional. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, has actually gone on record and has said, in order to reduce inflation, we need to see the economy cool down, which will happen when money is more expensive to borrow and when the unemployment rate goes up. And that's because typically as unemployment goes up, consumer spending typically goes down. So the Fed is actively trying to get companies to let people go, to slow down this rapid growth in consumer spending that we're seeing, which is triggering this increased inflation. Another issue I see with interest rates today is a lot of people assume that interest rates are at historic highs and eventually they're going to go back down to where they were prior to all of this. And I'm definitely not an expert in this, so I'm not going to try to predict the future, but I think that method of thinking is dangerous. When you look at interest rates over the history of the US, the interest rates we have today that most people think are high are actually historically low when you look back in time. The problem is that over the last decade, we've gotten used to historically low interest rates. So we may see interest rates lower a bit, but I don't think people should assume that they're going back to where they were. Okay, enough of that. Now let's talk about housing, which is the next area I see causing a lot of financial concern for people. And again, this has been directly impacted by interest rates, but there's a couple other factors we'll talk about as well. With interest rates on mortgages topping 8% today, mortgages have become more expensive than they were over the last couple decades. And the assumption that with these increased rates, the price of housing would also adjust and we would see home values lower. That would help accommodate these increased interest rates and keep housing somewhat affordable. After all, it was low interest rates that caused home values to skyrocket. So it makes sense that when we raise interest rates, we'd also see those home values drop, right? Well, that's not what happened. And there's multiple factors, but the main reason is that even though housing is becoming more unaffordable, there's still more buyers on the housing market than there are sellers. And why is there a shortage in housing? Well, for starters, people are simply staying put. A lot of people locked in record mortgage rates during the pandemic, and now they either don't want to buy a new property with high interest, or they simply cannot afford to. A lot of people are stuck in their current home because they simply can't afford to go anywhere else in the current market. As I'm sure is obvious, the pandemic also brought a huge shift in work from home, meaning a lot less people are moving as a requirement for work, further reducing the number of homes that those people are moving out of. And the last point, which is probably the biggest one, is that since the Great Recession back in 2008, Wall Street firms have actually been buying up hundreds of thousands of single-family homes for investment purposes. And we saw this trend increase during the pandemic when interest rates were super low. As big businesses continue to gobble up homes, supply stays low, and prices stay high. So basically, to summarize that, housing prices skyrocketed during the pandemic, but we haven't necessarily seen that dip that we thought was going to happen as interest rates raised. Let's look at this example to show you the problem that's going on. Let's say we have a 30-year, $500,000 mortgage at a 2.8% interest rate. The monthly payment on that mortgage would be $2,054 a month. While the same mortgage with an 8% interest rate, which is where we are today, would have a monthly payment of $3,669 a month. Now, it seems like that's almost doubled. Not quite, but pretty close. So housing is much more expensive than it was just 3 years ago when you factor in interest rates, which just isn't fun for a lot of people. So what can you take away from all of this? Well, number one, this is never fun advice to hear, but it's just a good time to be patient. I'm not predicting another housing crash or anything extreme, but the market does have a way of working its way out over time. If something is truly unaffordable, opportunities will come up for that to stabilize in one way or another. Advice number two, keep saving and investing towards your goals. Some of them may take a little bit longer considering inflation has impacted you, and it might take you a little bit longer to save up that down payment for your first home, but you'll get there. Just give it time. Keep saving, keep investing. Don't lose hope. Advice number three, make sure you're still following your budget. Sure, inflation is tough, it's hard, but your percentages on your budget should still be the same. It doesn't give you an excuse to overspend and spend more than you make. And my last piece of advice, continue to invest in yourself. In my opinion, the best way to battle inflation is to increase your income. So find ways to educate yourself, make yourself valuable, work hard, and build yourself a career that's going to allow you to be okay, even in times like now when things are pretty uncertain. And like I said, things are super tricky now, but the market will work itself out eventually. So just stay patient. You got this. If you like this video, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We'll see you all in the next one. Thanks, everyone.